I was loading hay bales when I heard the sound of splintering wood and metal grinding against concrete. Racing to my property line, I found my century-old ranch gate demolished, scattered in pieces across the dirt road, while a man in an orange hard hat was directing a bulldozer back toward a convoy of black SUVs. The same gate my great-grandfather had built by hand in 1924 was now kindling, and standing beside the destruction with a satisfied smirk was someone I'd never seen before, holding a clipboard and wearing a badge that looked suspiciously fake. What I discovered next would expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple property dispute. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 18 months ago, I was a federal marshal specializing in organized crime investigations. After 22 years of chasing fugitives and dismantling criminal networks across 3 states, I'd retired early to the Mitchell family ranch in Colorado, a 2,000-acre spread that had been in our family since the 1890s. This wasn't some hobby farm or weekend retreat. This was a working cattle operation with 300 head of Black Angus, mineral rights that extended deep underground, and water access that made our property invaluable in an increasingly drought-prone region. The ranch sat in what used to be complete isolation, surrounded by National Forest and Bureau of Land Management property that stretched for miles in every direction. But 6 months ago, developers had somehow secured permits to build Harmony Hills, an upscale residential community directly adjacent to our eastern boundary. Within weeks, construction crews were blasting access roads through previously untouched wilderness, and suddenly my peaceful retirement was filled with the constant noise of heavy machinery and the dust clouds that come with massive earth-moving operations. The first sign of trouble came when I received a certified letter from something called the Harmony Hills Property Management Authority, informing me that my ranch operations needed to comply with newly established community standards for the protection of residential property values and environmental quality. The letter was signed by Marcus Webb, Community Standards Director, and included a list of violations that would have been laughable if they hadn't been so insulting. According to their assessment, my cattle were creating noise pollution, my agricultural equipment violated noise ordinances, and my water usage was environmentally irresponsible. What made the letter particularly offensive was the demand that I attend a mandatory compliance hearing within 30 days to discuss remediation measures for my property. The tone was condescending and authoritative, written as if these people had some kind of legal jurisdiction over land that had been in my family for over a century. As a federal marshal, I dealt with enough fraudulent legal documents to recognize amateur hour when I saw it. But something about the professional presentation and specific regulatory language suggested this wasn't just another neighborhood busybody with a clipboard. I decided to drive over to Harmony Hills to get a better sense of what I was dealing with. And what I found was impressive in its scope and disturbing in its implications. The development wasn't just another subdivision of cookie-cutter houses. This was a master-planned community with its own security force, private roads, and what appeared to be significant financial backing. The entrance featured a guardhouse with uniformed personnel, electronic gate systems, and surveillance cameras that looked more appropriate for a corporate headquarters than a residential neighborhood. The security guard who approached my truck was polite but firm, explaining that Harmony Hills was a private community and access was restricted to residents and authorized personnel. When I mentioned that I owned the adjacent ranch and had received correspondence from their management authority, his demeanor shifted noticeably. He made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones for several minutes, and then informed me that someone would be out to meet with me shortly. Marcus Webb turned out to be a tall, thin man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself with the kind of artificial authority that immediately triggered my professional skepticism. He introduced himself as the Community Standards Director for Harmony Hills and explained that their organization was committed to maintaining the highest possible quality of life for residents who had invested substantial sums in their dream homes. His presentation was smooth and professional, but something about his eye contact and body language reminded me of the white-collar criminals I'd spent years investigating. During our conversation, Marcus made several claims that didn't add up to someone with legitimate expertise in property law or environmental regulation. He referenced county ordinances that I knew didn't exist, cited state regulations that had been repealed years earlier, and spoke about federal environmental requirements with the kind of vague confidence that suggested he was improvising rather than drawing from actual knowledge. Most tellingly, when I asked for specific citations of the laws, he claimed I was violating. He deferred to technical specialists who weren't available for immediate consultation. What concerned me most was Marcus's casual mention of other properties in the area that had been successfully brought into compliance with community standards. He spoke about negotiations with several ranching families who had agreed to modify their operations or sell portions of their land to resolve conflicts with residential development. The way he described these successes suggested a pattern of systematic pressure being applied to agricultural properties throughout the region. That evening, I called my former colleague Agent Diana Torres, who now worked environmental crimes for the FBI field office in Denver. When I described my interaction with Marcus Webb and the Harmony Hills operation, her response immediately confirmed my suspicions that something more serious was happening here. She'd been tracking similar complaints from rural property owners across Colorado, all involving mysterious management authorities representing upscale developments that seemed to have unusual influence with local government officials. According to Diana, the FBI had opened preliminary investigations into what appeared to be an organized scheme targeting agricultural properties in areas slated for high-end residential development. The pattern was consistent across multiple locations. Developers would acquire permits for luxury communities adjacent to working ranches, establish private management authorities with official-sounding names, and then systematically pressure neighboring property owners through fake regulatory compliance requirements until they agreed to sell their land at below-market prices. The criminal enterprise was sophisticated enough to create convincing documentation, hire personnel with legitimate-seeming credentials, and coordinate with local officials who were either complicit or incompetent enough to rubber-stamp permits without proper due diligence. What made the scheme particularly effective was that most ranching families didn't have the legal resources to challenge complex regulatory claims, especially when confronted with official-looking documents and threats of criminal prosecution for environmental violations. Diana's information helped me understand that the letter I'd received wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. She also warned me that these organizations had shown a willingness to escalate pressure through property damage, legal harassment, and even direct intimidation when property owners refused to cooperate with their demands. The gate destruction I'd witnessed was probably just the beginning of what would become an increasingly aggressive campaign to force me off my land. The next morning, I found tire tracks and boot prints around my main barn that hadn't been there the day before, along with what appeared to be surveying marks placed at various points around my property boundaries. Someone had been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance on my land, gathering information that would presumably be used to support future harassment or legal action. As a federal marshal, I recognized the signs of organized criminal activity, and I knew that passive resistance wouldn't be sufficient to protect my property or my family's legacy. I spent the afternoon installing professional-grade surveillance equipment around the ranch headquarters, focusing on areas where unauthorized access would most likely occur. Using skills I developed during organized crime investigations, I positioned cameras to provide overlapping coverage while remaining concealed from casual observation. I also activated my emergency communication systems and made sure my personal protection equipment was readily accessible, because experience had taught me that criminal organizations willing to engage in property destruction were usually willing to escalate to personal violence when their intimidation tactics failed. 2 days later, Marcus Webb returned with reinforcements, and the nature of their visit made it clear that my assessment of the situation had been accurate. Instead of arriving alone with clipboard authority, he brought a convoy of 3 black SUVs containing what appeared to be private security personnel. several individuals carrying surveying equipment, and someone who introduced himself as a compliance specialist with the Colorado Department of Environmental Quality. The supposed state environmental official was where Marcus made his first serious mistake, because as a federal marshal, I'd worked extensively with legitimate state and federal environmental enforcement personnel. This guy's credentials were obviously fraudulent. His understanding of actual environmental law was superficial, and his attempt to speak with official authority was so amateurish that it would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. When I challenged his credentials and asked for contact information to verify his authority with the state environmental agency, the fake official became visibly nervous and started deferring to Marcus Webb for answers. Real environmental enforcement officers don't defer to private compliance directors, and they certainly don't become evasive when asked to provide verification of their authority. I was dealing with criminal impersonation of government officials, which was a federal crime that carried serious penalties. Marcus's response to my challenges revealed the true nature of their operation and confirmed that this was indeed an organized criminal enterprise rather than a legitimate regulatory action. Instead of providing the documentation I'd requested, he began making barely veiled threats about the consequences of non-cooperation with official environmental investigations. He mentioned that property owners who refused to work with compliance specialists often found themselves facing criminal prosecution for environmental violations that could result in substantial fines and even imprisonment. The threats were delivered with the kind of practiced authority that suggested Marcus had used this script before, probably successfully, against property owners who didn't have my background in law enforcement. But threatening a federal marshal with criminal prosecution based on fraudulent regulatory claims was a serious error in judgment that would have significant consequences for everyone involved in this conspiracy. I told Marcus and his crew that I needed time to review their documentation with my legal counsel, and that any future communications should be directed through my attorney. This was a standard stalling technique that would give me time to coordinate with Diana Torres and develop a strategy for exposing the full scope of their criminal operation. What I didn't expect was for Marcus to respond by authorizing immediate property seizure under what he claimed were emergency environmental protection powers. The fake environmental official produced what appeared to be a court order authorizing the temporary seizure of my cattle and agricultural equipment pending resolution of environmental compliance issues. The document looked official enough to fool most people, complete with judicial seals and legal language copied from legitimate court orders, but I could immediately identify several formatting errors and legal inconsistencies that proved it was fraudulent. When I pointed out that the court listed on the seizure order didn't have jurisdiction over my property and that the supposed environmental violations weren't actually crimes under Colorado law, Marcus's facade of professional authority began to crack. He started speaking more aggressively about the consequences of interfering with official government business and the serious legal penalties for obstruction of environmental investigations. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately expose the entire criminal conspiracy and bring down what turned out to be a multi-million-dollar real estate fraud operation. Instead of continuing to play along with their charade, I pulled out my federal marshal's credentials and placed them under arrest for criminal impersonation of government officials, fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The reaction was immediate and revealing. The fake environmental official immediately tried to run, while the private security personnel reached for weapons that turned out to be completely illegal for civilian possession. Marcus Webb himself went through several emotional stages, from disbelief to anger to panic, as he realized that their carefully planned intimidation campaign had just run headfirst into someone with the authority and expertise to completely destroy their operation. Within minutes, I had 3 suspects in custody and was coordinating with Diana Torres to arrange for federal backup and evidence collection. The surveillance equipment I'd installed captured the entire interaction, providing irrefutable evidence of attempted extortion and criminal impersonation. More importantly, The documents and equipment in their vehicles would prove to be the key to unraveling a criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for several years. The initial arrests led to a comprehensive investigation that revealed the true scope of what the FBI would later describe as one of the most sophisticated real estate fraud schemes they'd encountered. Marcus Webb wasn't just a local criminal taking advantage of development pressure around my ranch. He was the operational director of a multi-state organization that had been systematically targeting agricultural properties in areas designated for luxury residential development. The criminal enterprise operated through a network of shell companies and fraudulent government authorities that created the appearance of legitimate regulatory oversight while actually functioning as sophisticated extortion operations. They would research properties with high development potential, establish fake management authorities with official-sounding names, and then pressure property owners through fraudulent regulatory compliance requirements until they agreed to sell their land at prices significantly below market value. What made the scheme particularly effective was their use of accomplices within local government who were either bribed to approve fraudulent permits or simply incompetent enough to rubber-stamp development applications without proper review. The conspiracy involved city planning officials, county commissioners, and even some state environmental agency personnel who had been providing inside information about upcoming development projects and regulatory changes. The investigation that followed my arrests of Marcus Webb and his crew ultimately resulted in federal charges against 47 individuals across 6 states, including government officials, private contractors, and the financial backers who had been funding the real estate acquisition campaign. The total value of properties that had been fraudulently acquired was estimated at over $200 million, representing hundreds of ranching families who had been pressured into selling their ancestral land through criminal intimidation and fake regulatory threats. The most disturbing aspect of the conspiracy was how systematically they had targeted vulnerable populations, particularly elderly ranchers, who lacked the financial resources to challenge complex regulatory claims in court. Many of these families had been terrorized by fake environmental investigations, threatened with criminal prosecution for violations that didn't exist, and ultimately forced to sell their properties to avoid what they believed were legitimate legal consequences. Marcus Webb's plea agreement revealed that the criminal organization had been particularly focused on properties with mineral rights and water access, taking advantage of drought concerns and energy development pressure to justify their fraudulent regulatory interventions. They had been coordinating with legitimate development companies that were either unaware of the criminal methods being used to acquire land or were deliberately maintaining plausible deniability about the source of their property acquisitions. The financial structure of the conspiracy was equally sophisticated, involving offshore banking, cryptocurrency transactions, and real estate investment trusts that obscured the true ownership of acquired properties. The criminal organization had been operating for nearly a decade, generating hundreds of millions in profits while systematically destroying rural communities and family ranching operations throughout the western United States. Diana Torres led the federal prosecution that ultimately resulted in prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years for the major participants in the conspiracy, along with complete asset forfeiture that allowed many victimized families to recover their properties or receive substantial financial compensation. Marcus Webb himself received an 18-year federal sentence and was ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims of his fraudulent regulatory schemes. The investigation also led to significant reforms in state and local government oversight of development permitting, with new requirements for verification of regulatory authority and increased penalties for official corruption in land use decisions. Several county commissioners and city planning officials were removed from office and faced their own criminal charges for accepting bribes in exchange for approving fraudulent development permits. For me personally, the experience reinforced why I'd become a federal marshal in the first place, and why even in retirement, I couldn't ignore criminal activity that threatened vulnerable people in my community. The The skills I'd developed during 22 years of law enforcement service proved invaluable in protecting not just my own property, but dozens of other ranching families who had been targeted by the same criminal organization. The Mitchell family ranch is now protected by conservation easements that prevent any future development pressure, and I've established a foundation that provides legal assistance to rural property owners facing questionable regulatory claims. The century-old gate that was destroyed during Marcus Webb's intimidation campaign has been rebuilt and reinforced, serving as a symbol of successful resistance against criminal organizations that prey on honest working families. 6 months after the federal prosecutions concluded, I received a letter from the Colorado Cattlemen's Association thanking me for exposing a conspiracy that had been quietly destroying ranching communities throughout the state. They estimated that my investigation had prevented the loss of over 50,000 acres of agricultural land and protected dozens of family operations that had been targeted for fraudulent acquisition. The letter also mentioned that my actions had inspired other retired law enforcement officers to become more active in protecting rural communities from similar schemes, leading to the formation of a volunteer network that assists local sheriff's departments in investigating complex property fraud cases. It's become a model for other states dealing with organized criminal enterprises that target agricultural properties in areas under development pressure. Looking back on the experience, I'm struck by how close the criminal organization came to succeeding with their intimidation campaign. If I hadn't had the professional background to recognize fraudulent regulatory claims and the law enforcement experience to coordinate with federal agencies, I probably would have joined the dozens of other property owners who had been pressured into selling their land through fake environmental compliance requirements. The most important lesson from this experience is that criminal organizations count on their victims being too intimidated or uninformed to challenge official-looking documentation and authoritative-sounding regulatory claims. They rely on people's respect for government authority and their fear of criminal prosecution to prevent effective resistance to their extortion schemes. But when their fake authority meets real authority, when their amateur criminal improvisation encounters professional law enforcement expertise, and when their intimidation tactics are challenged by someone who understands how the legal system actually works, their carefully constructed conspiracy collapses faster than a house of cards in a Colorado windstorm. The gate they destroyed has been replaced with something stronger. The ranch they tried to steal remains in my family, and the criminal organization that threatened our community is now serving federal prison sentences while their victims recover their property and their peace of mind. Sometimes the best way to protect your land is to know when you're dealing with criminals instead of legitimate authority figures, and to have the professional skills necessary to make sure the criminals are the ones who end up behind bars instead of their intended victims. Word count 3. Arshis. I need to continue and expand this story to reach the 8,000 word target, while maintaining the narrative quality and following the framework. The aftermath of Marcus Webb's arrest created a ripple effect throughout the Harmony Hills development that revealed just how deeply the criminal conspiracy had penetrated legitimate business operations. Within hours of his detention, FBI agents were executing search warrants on the development's sales office, construction trailers, and the homes of several key personnel who had been involved in the fraudulent regulatory scheme. What they discovered was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of legitimate real estate development for nearly 5 years. The Harmony Hills project itself was partially legitimate, funded by investors who believed they were participating in a standard luxury residential development, but the land acquisition strategy had been systematically criminal, using fake regulatory pressure to force neighboring property owners to sell their land at prices far below market value. The criminal organization had established multiple shell companies with official-sounding names like the Colorado Environmental Compliance Authority, the Western States Property Management Bureau, and the Regional Development Coordination Office. Each of these fake organizations had professional websites, printed letterhead, and personnel with business cards listing impressive but entirely fictitious government positions. Marcus Webb's operation had been particularly sophisticated in their use of technology to create the appearance of legitimate authority. They had developed databases of property ownership records, aerial photography of targeted ranches, and detailed financial profiles of property owners that allowed them to customize their intimidation campaigns based on each victim's specific vulnerabilities and financial circumstances. The investigation revealed that my ranch had been targeted not just because of its prime location adjacent to the Harmony Hills development, but because of our mineral rights and water access that would make the property extremely valuable for future expansion. The criminal organization had been planning to acquire my land through fraudulent regulatory pressure, then sell it to offshore investors for development projects that would never be subject to local environmental oversight or community input. Agent Torres coordinated with the Colorado Attorney General's office to freeze all assets associated with the criminal enterprise, including bank accounts, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios that had been generated through fraudulent property acquisitions. The total value of assets subject to forfeiture exceeded $400 million, representing years of criminal profits generated by terrorizing rural families throughout the western United States. The scope of the investigation expanded dramatically when federal agents discovered that the criminal organization had been coordinating with similar operations in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Each state operation used the same basic methodology: create fake regulatory authorities, target agricultural properties in areas designated for development, and pressure property owners through fraudulent compliance requirements until they agreed to sell their land below market value. The interstate nature of the conspiracy elevated the case to the attention of the Department of Justice's Organized Crime Task Force, which assigned additional resources to investigate what appeared to be one of the largest real estate fraud schemes in United States history. The case became a priority for federal prosecutors because of its potential impact on food security and rural economic stability throughout the western states. One of the most disturbing discoveries during the investigation was the extent to which the criminal organization had infiltrated legitimate government agencies through bribery and corruption. 7 county commissioners, 12 city planning officials, and 3 state environmental agency personnel were ultimately charged with accepting bribes in exchange for approving fraudulent development permits and providing confidential information about upcoming regulatory changes. The corruption investigation revealed that the criminal organization had been paying government officials substantial sums to expedite permit approvals for developments that should never have been authorized under existing environmental and zoning regulations. They had also been receiving advance notice of planned infrastructure projects, drought emergency declarations, and mineral rights auctions that allowed them to target specific properties with precise timing. Marcus Webb's plea agreement provided crucial information about the internal structure of the criminal organization, including the identity of financial backers who had been funding the land acquisition campaign from offshore accounts. The investigation traced money flows through cryptocurrency exchanges, international banking networks, and real estate investment trusts that had been specifically designed to obscure the criminal source of property acquisition funds. The financial investigation revealed that the ultimate beneficiaries of the criminal conspiracy were foreign investors who had been purchasing large amounts of American agricultural land through fraudulent acquisition schemes. This discovery elevated the case to national security status, as it involved systematic foreign acquisition of properties with strategic importance for food production and natural resource access. The national security implications of the case attracted the attention of congressional oversight committees, which began investigating how foreign investors had been able to acquire so much American agricultural land through criminal enterprises that had operated undetected for years. The hearings revealed significant gaps in federal monitoring of foreign investment in strategic agricultural properties. During my testimony before the House Committee on Homeland Security, I described how sophisticated the criminal organization had been in creating the appearance of legitimate regulatory authority, while actually functioning as an organized extortion operation. Committee members were particularly concerned about the ease with which foreign criminal enterprises could target American agricultural properties without detection by existing federal monitoring systems. The congressional hearings led to new federal legislation requiring enhanced disclosure of foreign investment in agricultural properties and increased penalties for criminal organizations that target rural communities through fraudulent regulatory schemes. The legislation, known as the Rural Property Protection Act, was signed into law 6 months after the conclusion of the federal prosecutions. Meanwhile, the impact on my own life had been transformative in ways I hadn't expected when I first retired to the family ranch. Instead of the quiet agricultural life I'd planned, I found myself serving as a consultant to federal law enforcement agencies investigating similar rural property fraud schemes in other parts of the country. The expertise I'd gained from experiencing the criminal organization's methods firsthand, combined with my federal law enforcement background, made me uniquely qualified to help other rural communities recognize and resist similar fraudulent schemes. The FBI asked me to develop training materials for local sheriff's departments on identifying organized criminal enterprises that target agricultural properties. The training program I developed has been implemented in over 200 rural counties across 15 states, helping local law enforcement officers recognize the warning signs of systematic property fraud and coordinate with federal agencies when criminal conspiracies cross state lines. The program has already prevented several attempted criminal acquisitions of agricultural properties by identifying fake regulatory schemes before they could successfully pressure property owners into selling. One of the most satisfying aspects of my post-retirement law enforcement work has been helping other ranching families recover properties that had been fraudulently acquired through criminal intimidation schemes. The asset forfeiture proceeds from the Marcus Webb case, created a victim compensation fund that has allowed dozens of families to repurchase their ancestral land at fair market prices. The compensation process revealed the full human cost of the criminal conspiracy, as families shared their experiences of being terrorized by fake environmental investigations and threatened with criminal prosecution for violations that never existed. Many elderly ranchers had developed serious health problems from the stress of believing they were facing criminal charges and potential imprisonment for continuing their normal agricultural operations. The psychological impact on rural communities had been devastating, as the criminal organization's systematic intimidation campaigns had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that persisted long after the criminal prosecutions concluded. Many ranching families had become reluctant to invest in property improvements or expansion because they feared attracting the attention of fake regulatory authorities. Community healing became an important part of the recovery process, as local officials worked to rebuild trust between rural residents and legitimate government agencies that had been damaged by the criminal organization's impersonation of environmental enforcement officers. Public meetings were held throughout the affected regions to educate property owners about their rights and how to verify the credentials of anyone claiming regulatory authority. The education campaign emphasized that legitimate government environmental officers always provide proper credentials, contact information for their agencies, and detailed citations of specific laws or regulations that allegedly have been violated. Real enforcement officers encourage property owners to verify their authority through official channels and provide time for consultation with legal counsel before taking any enforcement actions. The contrast between legitimate regulatory enforcement and criminal impersonation became a crucial element of the community education program, as many rural residents had been intimidated by the criminal organization precisely because they respected government authority and wanted to comply with legitimate environmental regulations. Teaching people how to distinguish between real and fake authority became essential for preventing future victimization. The long-term impact of the case extended far beyond the specific criminal prosecutions, as it led to comprehensive reforms in state and local government oversight of development permitting and environmental enforcement. New requirements for verification of regulatory credentials and increased penalties for corruption in land use decisions have made it much more difficult for criminal organizations to operate through fake government authority. The case also highlighted the importance of supporting rural communities through federal law enforcement resources that are specifically trained to recognize and investigate complex property fraud schemes. Many rural sheriff's departments lack the resources and expertise necessary to investigate sophisticated criminal enterprises that operate across multiple jurisdictions using fake regulatory authority. Federal grant programs now provide funding for rural law enforcement agencies to receive specialized training in investigating property fraud cases and coordinating with federal agencies when criminal conspiracies involve interstate operations or foreign investors. These programs have significantly improved the ability of rural communities to protect themselves against organized criminal enterprises. The Mitchell family ranch has become something of a symbol for successful resistance against criminal organizations that target rural communities, and I regularly receive visits from ranching families who are facing similar challenges with questionable regulatory claims. The experience of successfully exposing a major criminal conspiracy has made our property a destination for people seeking advice on protecting their land from fraudulent acquisition schemes. These visits have reinforced my understanding of how widespread the problem of rural property fraud has become. As criminal organizations adapt their methods to take advantage of legitimate environmental concerns and development pressure in agricultural communities. The success of the Marcus Webb prosecution has apparently encouraged other criminal enterprises to develop more sophisticated impersonation techniques and more convincing fake documentation. This ongoing evolution of criminal tactics makes it essential for rural communities to maintain vigilance against fraudulent regulatory schemes and to preserve strong connections with federal law enforcement agencies that have the resources and expertise necessary to investigate complex property fraud cases. The criminal organizations that target agricultural properties are sophisticated, well-funded, and internationally connected, requiring equally sophisticated law enforcement responses. The personal satisfaction of protecting my family's ranch and exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatened dozens of other families has been immense, but it has also reinforced my commitment to public service that originally motivated me to become a federal marshal, even in retirement. The opportunity to use my professional skills to protect vulnerable communities from organized criminal enterprises remains deeply meaningful. The rebuilt gate at the entrance to the Mitchell Ranch now bears a plaque commemorating the successful investigation that exposed the Harmony Hills criminal conspiracy and protected agricultural properties throughout the region. The plaque serves as a reminder that criminal organizations may be sophisticated and well-funded, but they cannot ultimately succeed against communities that are informed, vigilant, and supported by competent law enforcement. The experience has taught me that retirement from federal law enforcement doesn't mean retirement from the responsibility to protect communities from criminal enterprises that threaten their security and economic stability. The skills and experience gained through decades of federal service remain valuable tools for defending rural communities against organized criminal activity that specifically targets their way of life. As I look out over the ranch that has been in my family for over a century, I'm reminded that protecting agricultural communities from criminal enterprises is about more than just individual property rights. It's about preserving a way of life that is essential to American food security and rural economic stability, and ensuring that future generations can continue to make their living from the land that their ancestors worked to preserve. The gate they destroyed has been rebuilt stronger than before. The ranch they tried to steal remains in my family's hands. The criminal organization that threatened our community is serving federal prison sentences, and the rural communities they targeted now have the knowledge and resources necessary to recognize and resist similar criminal enterprises in the future. Sometimes the best defense against organized crime is a good offense, especially when that offense is conducted by someone who understands how criminal organizations operate and has the professional connections necessary to ensure that justice is served swiftly and completely. The success of the federal prosecution against Marcus Webb's criminal organization had unexpected consequences that extended far beyond my original goal of protecting the family ranch. Within 6 months of the convictions, I was receiving calls from rural communities across the western United States, all dealing with variations of the same fraudulent regulatory scheme that had targeted my property. The most disturbing case came from a small ranching community in Montana, where an elderly couple named Frank and Dorothy Peterson had been terrorized by fake environmental enforcement officers for over 8 months. The criminal organization operating in their area had convinced the Petersons that their cattle operation was violating federal water quality regulations and that they faced potential criminal prosecution unless they agreed to sell their property to approved environmental remediation contractors. When I visited the Peterson Ranch at the request of the local sheriff's department, I found a family that had been psychologically devastated by the systematic intimidation campaign. Dorothy Peterson had developed severe anxiety attacks and hadn't slept through the night in months. Convinced that federal agents were going to arrest her husband for environmental crimes that existed only in the imagination of criminal extortionists. The fake documentation presented to the Petersons was remarkably similar to what Marcus Webb's organization had used against my ranch, suggesting coordination between criminal enterprises operating in different states. The fraudulent environmental compliance orders even used similar legal language and formatting, indicating that these criminal organizations were sharing methods and possibly operating under centralized direction. Working with the Montana Sheriff's Department and FBI field office in Helena, I helped coordinate an investigation that ultimately exposed another multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy targeting agricultural properties throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. The investigation revealed that the criminal organizations in Montana and Colorado had been coordinating their activities through encrypted communications and shared financial networks. The Montana case proved even more complex than the Colorado prosecution because the criminal organization had successfully pressured 12 ranching families into selling their properties before law enforcement became aware of the scheme. Recovering these fraudulently acquired properties required extensive legal proceedings and international cooperation to trace money flows through offshore banking systems. The personal impact of helping the Peterson family recover their peace of mind was profoundly satisfying, but it also revealed how many other rural communities were dealing with similar threats without adequate law enforcement support. Many small sheriff's departments lacked the resources and expertise necessary to investigate sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated across state lines using fake federal authority. This realization led me to expand my consulting work with federal law enforcement agencies to include direct assistance to rural communities facing fraudulent regulatory schemes. I began traveling regularly to ranching areas where questionable compliance orders or environmental enforcement actions were creating concern among agricultural property owners. The pattern recognition skills I developed during my federal marshal career proved invaluable in distinguishing between legitimate regulatory enforcement and criminal impersonation schemes. Real environmental enforcement officers follow specific procedures, provide detailed documentation of alleged violations, and offer clear appeal processes for property owners who dispute their findings. Criminal organizations, by contrast, rely on intimidation and urgency to prevent their victims from seeking verification of their authority. They make vague references to federal regulations without providing specific citations, demand immediate compliance without offering appeal procedures, and threaten serious consequences for any delay in cooperation with their demands. One of the most effective tools I developed for rural communities was a simple verification checklist that property owners could use when confronted with questionable regulatory claims. The checklist includes specific questions about credentials, agency contact information, regulatory citations, and enforcement procedures that legitimate officers can easily answer, but criminal impersonators typically cannot. The verification checklist has been distributed to ranching associations, agricultural extension offices, and rural law enforcement agencies throughout the western states. Feedback from these organizations indicates that the checklist has prevented dozens of attempted property fraud schemes by teaching rural residents how to recognize criminal impersonation of government authority. Perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this expanded law enforcement work has been training other retired federal agents to assist rural communities with property fraud investigations. The Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association now coordinates a volunteer program that provides experienced investigators to help local sheriff's departments deal with complex criminal enterprises targeting agricultural properties. The volunteer program has grown to include over 300 retired federal agents from various law enforcement agencies, creating a network of experienced investigators who understand both rural community dynamics and sophisticated criminal organizations. This combination of expertise has proven particularly effective in investigating criminal enterprises that specifically target agricultural communities. The program's success led to federal funding through the Department of Agriculture for expanded rural property protection initiatives, including grants for local law enforcement training and equipment purchases, specifically designed to help rural communities investigate property fraud cases. These federal resources have significantly improved the ability of rural areas to protect themselves against organized criminal enterprises. My own involvement in these protection efforts has completely transformed my retirement experience, turning what I expected to be a quiet agricultural life into continued public service that feels even more meaningful than my original federal career. The opportunity to use decades of law enforcement experience to protect vulnerable rural communities from sophisticated criminal organizations has provided a sense of purpose that I hadn't anticipated. The personal relationships I've developed with ranching families throughout the region have also enriched my understanding of rural community dynamics and the specific vulnerabilities that criminal organizations exploit when targeting agricultural properties. These families often have deep emotional connections to land that has been in their families for generations, making them particularly susceptible to threats that could force them to abandon their heritage. The psychological impact of fraudulent regulatory schemes extends far beyond financial losses, as families experience profound stress from believing they are facing criminal prosecution for continuing agricultural operations that have been legal and environmentally responsible for decades. The healing process after exposure of criminal fraud often takes years and requires ongoing community support. Looking toward the future, I expect that criminal organizations will continue to evolve their methods for targeting rural properties, taking advantage of legitimate environmental concerns and development pressure to create new opportunities for fraudulent regulatory schemes. The success of federal prosecutions in Colorado and Montana has apparently encouraged criminal enterprises to develop more sophisticated impersonation techniques and more convincing fake documentation. This ongoing threat makes it essential for rural communities to maintain strong connections with federal law enforcement agencies and to preserve the training programs that help local officers recognize sophisticated criminal enterprises. The protection of agricultural communities from organized criminal activity requires sustained federal commitment and continued coordination between rural and urban law enforcement resources. The Mitchell family ranch remains a symbol of successful resistance against criminal organizations that target rural communities, but it has also become a headquarters for ongoing efforts to protect agricultural properties throughout the western United States. The rebuilt gate at our entrance now welcomes law enforcement officers, ranching families, and community leaders who are working together to ensure that future generations can continue to make their living from the land without fear of criminal intimidation.